I want to welcome everybody to the January 2012 meeting of the Committee on Agency Operations. I would like to remind everyone that this meeting is being broadcast via internet. The first action item on the agenda is approval of the minutes of October 26th Committee on Agency Operations meeting.
Move to approve.
Well, motion has been made and it has been seconded.
Mr. Chairman, before you make the working with the error, it shows your name and
Yeah, at the top of the agenda shows the actual voting members of the committee. So.
Yeah, I guess we need to make this correction.
Yeah, we'll make a correction.
Now, I guess all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
That's corrected.
As corrected.
Motion carries. For the agenda item number 3, I would like to call on Dr. Arturo Alonso to introduce the staff and topics for this meeting's report. He will provide us some background information. These items require no action. Dr. Alonso, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first report is the standing report on our financials that I provide to the AOC on a quarterly basis. And we sent you a report a couple of weeks ago electronically, and I believe we put a hard copy here at the places, Sharon, or do you have an extra hard copy? We have extra ones in case you need to refer to them. As customary, I will not go over every page in detail, but we'll provide a few highlights and respond, of course, to any questions either during the report or at the end. On page 2 and 3 of the report, we provide a summary of the operating budget, of our operations budget, by strategies, with expenditures and encumbrances as of December 31st, 2011, along with the available budget for the rest of the year. I would like to remind you that for this purpose, we manage the budget at the strategy level. So while you may see some pluses and minuses there on the availability within each strategy, all strategies are either at or below target and are in good shape. On page 4 and 6, 4 through 6, excuse me, we list any adjustments that we have made to the approved budget that resulted from that have been made since the final passage of the Appropriations Act, and might have include additions or changes have come about since September 1st. This may seem like a lot of accounting interest to you, but we provide this in the spirit of full transparency and openness. Increases in budget items or changes between strategies are approved by the appropriate division head, the 2 deputy commissioners, and the commissioner. This is one of the things that we pledged from the beginning, that we would provide all changes or anything that affected the budget. On page 7 and 8, you have the same information that...
Yes, let me interrupt.
I'm sorry.
I don't know, this was emailed out, but I don't know if everybody has a copy handy. So do we have hard copies of the...
Okay, I'm sorry.
I think they're being handed out.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So just if you need a copy, wave, raise your hand, wad up a piece of paper, throw it at.
You'll be sorry. Okay. So you will start over, Mr. Chairman, or at least on the pages. Okay, page 2 and 3 of the report. That's where we provide you the summary of our operations budget by strategies with the encumbrances and expenditures as of the December 31st. And then the right-hand column shows you the available budget for the rest of the year. And again, let me just point out that we manage at the strategy level, so while there may be some pluses and minuses within each strategy, the strategy, all the strategies are on target or below to be spent and to being managed by the division heads. On page, yes,
Arturo, I
Fred.
think since we do have a lot of new board members who, some of whom are seeing this presentation for the first time, you might stop not only for questions, but you might also explain how you calculate encumbrances for the balance of the fiscal year to date. 'Cause
Sure.
As people look through a budget, there's a tendency to look at what we spent, what's left, and then the encumbrances, of course, a big percentage of the.
Yes. There are two main items that will make up the encumbrances. Any commitments that we make outside the agency, such as a purchase order or a contract or grant that has made its way through the system, approved by the committee and then by the board, we encumber once we get a full contract in place, not before, because before that it's just going through the system. So that would include any items that have been committed. In the operations budget, the majority of the encumbrances is for the salaries. We encumber the rest of the year, or the full year, for every staff member that's on board. So if somebody comes in or leaves, the encumbrances go up or down depending on at what time of the year they leave. So that's mainly what makes up the encumbrances on both the operations and the trustee funds.
Okay, but that I guess the point there is that the salaries are changed as attrition or other changes in staffing levels happen.
Or new additions, yes, right.
Just as an example, you were talking about the strategies like participation and success.
Yes.
The interfund transfer there, you have 532,502. Now, was that money was it utilized in some other area? Here, if you want to look at
No, and I've got one somewhere here. Here, it's right. It comes from the other areas. In this case,
Okay, from
the trustee funds.
okay.
Any other questions? Okay, so then let me skip through to page 4 and 6. As I was saying, this is simply a listing of the adjustments that we make to the budget throughout the year. It's debits and credits, but again, 4 or 5 years ago, we pledged that we would be truly transparent, and so we list any, so that in case you have any questions of why we made any adjustments to the budget that the board approved back in July. And as I said, any changes that are between strategies or that increase the budget are approved by, of course, the division head, and then the 2 deputy commissioners and the commissioners. So they're not made in isolation in any one unit. Page 7 and 8 is the same information that that I talked about in the operating budget, except that this is for our trustee funds. Again, budgeted versus expended and encumbrance with the availability reflected at the end. There's a new addition to the report that on trustee funds that I want to point out. I'd call your attention to the last entry on the use of revenues on the top of page 12. And I'm just noticing that my pages may not be the same as yours. I don't know what happened to the pagination. It is.
Page 12?
Okay, it's not page 12. I said page 12, but what I really meant was page 7. 7 of 12. Sorry for that. You will see there that at the bottom of the page there, where we're including $875 million of community college funds. This is new to the reporting here on this quarterly report. These funds, as some of you know, may not be aware, are appropriated directly to the CB, or not appropriated directly to our bill pattern. But we disperse them monthly through the community college formulas, and therefore we are accountable for those funds. So to better reflect the funds that we handle, I thought that it would be a good thing to include them on there, even though if you were to compare this to our bill pattern, to our Appropriation Act, you would not see that directly appropriate to us. And so, as you can see, there's no problem with the community colleges expanding those funds. I think they are well on their way to expanding their formula funds. Another new addition is on page, and if I may look on your, make sure I give you the right page. It's on page 9 of your report, 9 and 10, where we present a new and more detailed listing of all the federal funds that we manage here in the agency. These are by federal contract period, and this is what makes this important and meaningful for us, at least for us as we manage our federal contracts. Because not all federal contracts, in fact, very few of them, align with the state's fiscal year. They stop, or they start and stop at different periods of the year. And so we track them by what we call a contract period, not the federal, not the state fiscal year. And so I added this because it gives a meaningful insight into the federal grants that we are managing, and so that you know that what programs we are managing that come to us from the federal sources. So again, that's a new addition.
You have, could I interrupt? Excuse me. You have 4 funds there that are in negative balance. Could you explain?
I will take a look at them. The first one is the College Access Challenge Grant from FY11. We have the statewide longitudinal data system, the Teacher Quality Administration, and the Perkins Administration for FY12. Let me call on Susan Corrine to answer that question.
Good afternoon. I'm Susan Corrine. I worked with Arturo Alonso on the financials. The cash balance that you would see, you would want to see a negative there. That indicates the amount that we've drawn from our federal reserve, the federal bank, if you will. And so we do a cost reimbursable grant. So once we've expended the funds, then we would seek a reimbursement for those funds. So this just indicates that the expenditure has hit our books, but we've not yet requested our reimbursement from the feds.
Or received it.
Or received it.
Right. In other words, this is the cash balance. Thank you, Susan. I knew that answer, but I just didn't remember it. Because we are on cost reimbursable, federal regulations prohibit us from having cash in the bank for over 3 days. Or if we do, we have to remit any interest earned on those funds back to the feds. So when Susan says that it's a good thing that it shows a negative balance, it means that we are not drawing before we spend the money.
But there are federal funds available, and we should expect, if we request them, it will be reimbursed.
Oh, definitely. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan.
At the end of the fiscal year, the balance would be 0.
At the end of the fiscal year, the balance will be 0 because we'll draw down what we have expended. The last 2 pages summarize our loan and debt obligations as of December 31st. And this is a standing part of the report that we have always provided. It gives us the information on our loan program. If there's any questions, we'll be glad to respond to those. If not, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my report on the financials, and we'd be glad to respond to any questions on any part of the report.
I have one question, Arturo, that I ask periodically. The default rate we report to the LBB, it says historical 10.53% on the last page, bottom of the last page.
Yes.
Historical over what period of time, and are there any trends up or down that we should take note of in that figure? I figured Dan would find his way to the front on this.
Good afternoon. Historical in this case is forever. So it's every loan that's ever been originated from the program back to 1965. And then it's a cumulative up until the quarter end date that we report to the LBB. Actually, the trend on this in the last year has been slight upticks because we also include interest accruals in our default portfolio. So if we have a increasing interest on an old judgment that we haven't collected on yet, that shows up as an increase in default. Okay, so it's been about 10.5%, and we actually changed the metric and how we calculate this a couple of years ago because when we migrated to the new loan system, the data that we had was much more
Accurate?
well, accurate isn't the right word. It was to a greater level of detail than we previously had. So we didn't have a very good handle on what our judgment portfolio was, and this goes back to maybe 2006. Now we know exactly what our portfolio looks like. You would expect over time, given our current structure of our portfolio and our underwriting criteria, I keep expecting this number to peak and start to trend downward, just because the nature of our portfolio has changed over the years. We haven't gotten to that point yet. So maybe tenths of percentages of increases is what we've been seeing kind of quarter over quarter. But eventually I'm expecting it to hit some kind of a peak and then to start tapering off. This also goes hand in hand with our agreement with the OAG's office to collect on our judgment accounts. They've recently added a couple of staff members with the approval of the board to pursue our post-judgment collections more vigorously. So we have a number of activities in place that are intended to mitigate any further increases, and ultimately we expect that number to start dropping.
We're
But it's going to
in
take
the second year of that agreement?
This is the third. We're entering into the third year
Entering
of
into the
that
third year,
agreement.
okay.
But again, when you're calculating a number with the denominator being forever, trends tend to take a long time to start manifesting. So I haven't gotten terribly worked up about the tenths of percentages of increases, but if it keeps going up, then I think we'll come back and present that as here are the issues that are currently going on in the marketplace. We haven't seen our current portfolio. The default rate on the current portfolio in repayment is actually very good, much less than you might expect, much less than the 10.5%.
But what's the figure?
Pardon me, I'm going to get Susan Brown's reading glasses. So we have various portfolios, and we calculate default rates various ways. The largest portfolio is I have pink ones at home, so this is probably not.
I'd like to take credit for this just being a setup, but
Actually, my prescription is not that bad. Default rate 1 is 6.06%. So that's on Cal TFT Heal and Help, the far left-hand column. So that's our largest portfolio balance. That 6.06% is loans that are currently in repayment that have been reflective as being defaulted. So I view that as our current default rate. But even that is a little bit misleading because it's still accumulating all the loans that are in default, even back if they've been in default for years. That's still reflected in that 6% number.
okay, so it's being cumulative. It's really, we've talked about this before, but it doesn't come off as charting kind of an annual.
Well, and we've been working with the Sunset folks trying to capture a more reflective default rate that they could ultimately compare to federal loans because that's very well presented. You can go to any website and get federal default rates. Because our state loans default at 180 days and the federal loans default at 270 days, you have an automatic discrepancy in comparing those two numbers, and we also send a nasty letter from the AG's office at 150 days. So as soon as you get beyond 150 days and start comparing to a 270-day number, there's a lot of other factors going on that we haven't been able to tease out necessarily. And then the other part of that is the federal rate is based on a 2-year cumulative time period. So it's, I go into repayment, I've got 2 years to capture defaults, and then we go back and look at it continuing to go on if you ever defaulted. So our rate tends to be a little bit higher than what the federal rate would be under that same kind of a time period. So long explanation, we've gone back and looked at the Cal portfolio of loans that entered into repayment since September 1st of 2008, and our 2-year default rate is about 7.1%. So trying to capture this comparison to the federal portfolio or to federal loans, and then that essentially is every loan that's went into repayment under any kind of previous underwriting criteria. So we've narrowed our underwriting criteria pretty substantially since 2007. So we have a pretty tight, we're expecting a pretty tight default going forward simply because we've been very consistent with our underwriting with cosigners and borrowers. I've talked a lot. You have questions or?
That helps give more context. My last question, and maybe there's some others, would be just when you say we've seen a slight uptick the last year, from what to 10.53? Where were we a year?
I think the original was 10.17. Over the last couple of years, it's gone up 0.4%, and I can go back and verify that number. I think our LBB targets from a couple of years ago were 10.17 or 10.23.
Mr. Chairman. Dan, let me see if I understand. You said this 10.51 was since inception of the program?
That's correct.
So if you're calculating a rate of delinquency, I mean, there's loans that have been paid off and gone away, and so doesn't our balance change?
The balance change, the spreadsheet that we calculate with has a kind of a captured historical disbursement category. So it's this historical disbursement since 1965, and it's $2.5 billion, or, I mean, it's a huge number. And then we have a fixed default of that historical. So this is prior to 2007 when we converted to our new system. So we took a snapshot of the portfolio prior to conversion. So we use that as our base, that's kind of our base default rate. And then all of the activity that's gone on since conversion, we have probably 5 or 6 different line items of various default statuses that we capture out of the loan system. So we've issued $500 million of loans in the last 5 years, and our defaulted is, X number of millions of dollars. And then we merge those two figures. So we capture that historical figure and then add on top of it what's been going on since we converted in 2007 to get just one big number at the bottom. It's not particularly helpful for us because it really is irrelevant to what's going on currently. So the figures we look at are exactly the figures that you are looking at, what's currently going on, and is there any trends going on that gives us cause for concern.
So then the default rate 1 and 2 are much more significant to what's going on now?
Yes, sir, and one of them is inclusive of students that are in school, which we use for some financial calculations, not for trending purposes. And then the other one excludes the students that are in school, because if I'm in school, I'm not repaying, and if I'm not repaying, I'm not defaulting. So we're really trying to narrow down our kind of.
So those are excluded from the calculation?
The default rate 2 essentially excludes the in-school. I'm sorry, default rate 1 excludes the in-school. Default rate 2 includes the in-school. So we're looking at those that are in repayment, and then we're looking at the entire portfolio. And we use those numbers in our financial calculation.
Don't you mean the other way around? I mean,
The higher
if-
number excludes the in-school. The higher default rate excludes students that are in school,
That's the 7.1?
which would be 6.06 on the Cal on the far left-hand side.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I see where you're at.
So if I'm including everybody that's in school, that they're not defaulting, that percentage goes down because my denominator is much larger. Right?
Okay.
So
I may
we
have
never write
explained
off
it
any
wrong.
loan, is that correct? We do not write off any loan at all. If I remember last time, the thinking was that we always keep the loan on the books. I do not understand that. Why don't we think of writing off the loans more than 10 years old, more than 5 years old?
We have, it's not on there. We don't write off any loans except we do have provisions with the comptroller's office to identify loans as being uncollectible. So from a financial accounting perspective, we do write off loans. We don't ever write them off in our loan management system. They still are out there, and if somebody hits the lottery on a truly uncollectible loan, we still go get that money. But from an accounting standpoint, and the Attorney General has given us the ability to write off loans from an accounting perspective, we deem those accounts to be uncollectible. And every year we have a set of criteria that if the balance is less than $1,000 or there's been no activity in the last 2 years, or it's more than 10 years old, or there's a laundry list of criteria that each particular uncollectible loan is evaluated on. And if those loans are deemed to be uncollectible, then we actually do write off those loans on our financial statements. And there's an entry for that when you look at our financial statements. But the long answer to your short question is we don't write off loans, but we do have provisions to take them off of our financial statements. But it's a very narrow band of loans that meet that kind of a threshold.
Aren't they also written off? Is there a provision for death or total disability, or
Yes. Yes.
they are written off at that?
Those are forgiven. Written off isn't the
Yeah.
same context, but if I'm a borrower and I die, or if I become permanently disabled, if I'm in good standing, then those are forgiven and written off. But that's within the provisions of the loan
Okay.
program itself.
Kind of a little higher level on this, and I would think what's relevant is the default rates and how it affects our credit standings and the other credits that we're peered against, right? You know,
I'm
the other
sorry.
issuers and how our credit standing is vis-a-vis the default rate? And how do you see us in perhaps the last 2 or 3 years against our peer groups? Do you see that our cost of borrowing is going up or down relative to who we plot ourselves against in terms of borrowing cost? Doesn't the default rate really affect our
Great
cost of
question. I
borrowing?
guess we're a state general obligation debt issuer, and we can get into some of these kind of questions on a subsequent agenda item. But the credit of our debt issuance is based on the credit of the state of Texas. It's not based on the loan portfolio itself. Our bond issues say state of Texas, but they also say college student loans because that's the underlying business that supports that particular issue. Our peers, I mean, because of the federal regulations that currently exist, our peers are really only other commercial banks. So Wells Fargo, Sallie Mae, Discover, which there is not a lot of information from those particular entities on their underwriting criteria for private loans, nor what do they have to do from a market standpoint of borrowing money to make private student loans. The market in Texas has substantially changed in the last couple of years because the federal federal changes that have gone on since 2008. We are, I think some data we got from institutions, we make up about 50% of the private higher education loan volume in the state. So we have 50%, and then all of the other banks essentially have the other 50%. Predominantly, we are a federal loan state. Most of our students get subsidized, unsubsidized staffer loans, or you get parent plus loans to fund students' higher education. We are a small niche player that's a kind of a whole different kind of a conversation. But the market has changed dramatically in the last couple of years, and we view it as kind of going to continue to change over the next couple of years if the federal legislation isn't modified in some form or fashion, because literally if you're either a federal loan or you're not, and because we're a state issuer, we are treated just like every other issuer of unsecured debt. So how that's all going to play out over the next few years, we're not quite sure how that's going to. Our state probably has been less affected than other states. There are 15 other states that have similar types of programs to Texas. We're not the biggest. We feel like we're the best. Because of packaging rules that are currently in place, it's difficult for financial aid offices to package state loans, and other states have shown a dramatic drop in their volume that they do. We haven't seen as much of a drop, but we also haven't seen much of an increase, despite the fact that we have very attractive rates for students and cosigners.
So where did the shortfall in that represented by default rates? Is it just reconciled with the state since it's the ultimate issuer?
It's managed within the portfolio itself. When we set our interest rates for the upcoming academic year, we look at our cash flow analysis looks at what our current default rate is, what do we think our expected future default rate is, what's our current fund balance if we make loans. If we continue to make loans at 5.25%, which is what we're currently at, what does our cash flow model reflect out until the program essentially ceases to exist? It's completely self-contained. So if our default rate, for instance, went from 6 to 12, not saying that he would, but if it did, our interest rate that we charge our future borrowers would be adjusted to reflect the fact that our default rate had increased. So there really isn't an impact necessarily on the state as the ultimate, backstop from the debt standpoint. It really is incumbent upon the coordinating board to set an interest rate and the commissioner to set an interest rate that covers our operating expenses as well as our debt service obligations going forward.
Mr. Chairman, Dan, if we're using default rate to establish the interest rate, then why does it make sense to go through back to inception? Why not use the 5 or 10 year default rate?
We don't always get to tell the LBB what we want the performance metrics to be.
So we're required to go back?
This has been the way that the rate has been calculated, and the LBB, because we're trending, we like to evaluate trends. They really don't ever like to change anything because it changes their trend calculations.
But to me, the realistic trend could be figured out on the basis of what's been happening in the last 5 or 10 years, not what happened 45 years ago.
Certainly. We can put that as part of our recommendations. I haven't been here terribly long, but it's usually kind of taboo of making a change on a performance metric. But it's certainly something we can ask for.
I think if it makes sense, we should try if,
Well, perhaps we could, I don't know how much, we don't want make-work projects, but we could perhaps satisfy the LBB, but also have our own performance benchmark.
Well, in a lot of regards, the manifestation of these last 2 pages was in response to previous board members trying to get a grasp on what does the loan portfolio look like and how is it performing. So this was really created for the board so that you could have a more current snapshot, but we also wanted to provide you what we also provide other entities in the state. And if you want to ignore that number, you can, but that's what we report to the LBB.
So is the LBB, is that rule in statute, or is that a rule they adopted? Because I guess I'm struggling with it. If the feds are counting a 270-day window and we're doing 180, we're comparing apples to oranges. Why don't we adopt one or the other so that we can benchmark ourselves against these other 15 states and the federal system? Number one would be my first question. And then number two, it seems to me that default rate 1 and default rate 2 are much more helpful to tell us what we're doing in real time. And can we have a historical trending of that? Is that going up? Is that going down? I mean, I think that this window, I agree with the chairman. If the LBB says we want to see this from inception historical rate, fine, give it that to them, but also give them this updated data that says default rate 1 is this, default rate 2 is that, and this is how we've worked to improve that, and these measures that we've having instituted are actually working.
Just to kind of answer a little bit answer your first question, because these are not guaranteed loans, the default, the 150 letter from the AG's office, 180-day default is already generous because the federal loans are guaranteed by the federal government. I think they've been more lenient in that default calculation because the backstop is the federal government. It's going to pay for that loan if it goes into default, and it's not rehabilitated. So because we're unsecured, we don't want a default date that's so far out into the future that our ability to actually get repayment on a defaulted loan goes down the longer you wait. So I appreciate trying to merge those two figures, but from our perspective, we kind of view the federal default calculations as not being realistic of real time what's going on, and we tend to think our way is better than the federal. Plus the fact that it's not guaranteed, that's a major concern of our part because it's the state's money. Always ends up being the state's money.
Well, I'll submit the federal's not guaranteed either. It's the people's money. Maybe that's why they're in the trouble they're in.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
And if I could ask you, what reasoning is there between the state's loans and the federal loans as far as the delinquencies? Why are the federal loans so much higher delinquencies?
We have credit underwriting standards and federal loans don't.
Okay. That might be an answer to some of your other problems here.
Well, look, I didn't know that this would get into the interesting discussion it has, but it might be helpful, and Dan, you can answer whether you think it would be helpful to trend line, to have next time we update this, just a graph that shows 5 or 10 years history of default rates 1 and 2. Would that tell us something about trends that would be meaningful?
How about if we do trend line since 2007 when we converted to our loan? Okay. We go back beyond 2007, it's a little squishier.
But you could keep it going forward from 07.
Absolutely.
If we do that, it'd also be helpful to see the rates we're charging and a spread to see what the credit cost is,
Yeah, you could graph
the risk
both of them.
premium is.
Graph them on the same sheet.
You'd think they'd be correlated.
Is this information only?
Thank you, Dan.
Yes.
That was informational?
Yes. This only,
well done.
no action is required on this item. So next agenda item is 4A is consideration of a resolution authorizing the issuance of State of Texas College student.
Mr. Chairman,
We didn't do 3B.
we have one other Deputy Commissioner's report.
Okay. Sorry.
The second report under my the Deputy Commissioner says an update on the initiatives that are underway in our Information Solutions and Services Division, our IT division, in other words. Some of you may recall that a year ago I introduced Sid as our new Assistant Commissioner, and one of his first tasks was to do a thorough assessment of the state of the division, what was needed, where we were, and so forth. And Sid did a very thorough job and a great job, and I'm going to now call on him to give us an update on where we are 1 year later regards several of the key initiatives. Before I ask Sid to give his presentation, I'd also like to mention that the report is specific to the IT-related items, but it is also a part of our larger lean processes and continuous improvement initiative. I will have some closing comments on that after Sid completes his report. Sid?
Okay. Thank you, Arturo. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, committee members. As Arturo mentioned, I spent the first couple of months on the job really conducting an assessment of the IT organization, our strengths and weaknesses, and reported on those findings at the April committee meeting last year. And looking at the folks up there, I don't see too many of you that were around back in April, but essentially with the end of the 2011 year, Dr. Alonso thought it would be an appropriate time to report back on the recommendations and initiatives I had undertaken or recommended at that time. Next slide, Sharon. By far the greatest need I identified was for a more formal IT governance in the organization. And by that I mean we really need a better means to identify and prioritize IT initiatives and projects. There was no formal mechanism in place. It was largely, whoever screams the loudest gets the attention that day. And there was constantly shifting priorities, constantly shifting resources in the organization, and that led to a lot of frustration, not only on the part of our clients, but also on my staff's part, being stretched in different directions. The first thing we did to address that particular issue was to establish an IT steering committee, and we had our first meeting last March, and that committee consists of the 2 deputy commissioners, the associate commissioner, and the 5 assistant commissioners. As I've discussed in previous meetings, we've also acquired project portfolio management software product, software as a service product, Inotas, and that product will allow us to managing our project portfolio much better and provide better information for the steering committee. I also restructured my entire division. I eliminated 1 director position. I merged 2 different departments into 1 to provide greater flexibility in the assignment of resources. And lastly, as I reported at the last meeting, we've created a new position called Business Relationship Manager. We've staffed 2 positions so far. We have a 3rd yet to staff. But we're hoping by having those folks in place, actually physically located with our business clients, the program areas, that we can improve communication with the business areas, have those people work with the business people to identify opportunities where IT can improve their operations, and also provide better documentation of requirements for new applications, cost-benefit analysis where necessary, and provide better information for the steering committee to make upon which to make their decisions. A second area of concern at that time was project management. We really didn't employ any formal project management methodology. Our PMs did not have a lot of formal PM training. What we've done since then is establish a formal project management office. We've also invested significantly in training our project managers. 2 of them are now formally certified by the Project Management Institute as project management professionals. The 3rd has completed her coursework and will be certified soon, I hope. And lastly, as part of our Lean initiative, we overhauled our entire processes for project management, developing new templates and guidelines for the use of project managers. The 3rd area was the systems development process itself, which was viewed in my discussions with executives and managers around the agency, was viewed as fairly ineffective. The process was deemed as too lengthy. The end product oftentimes did not meet the defined requirements from the outset. And there was really not a lot of communication while the project was underway. Our clients often didn't know the status of their project, whether it had been dropped from the queue entirely, whether resources had been reassigned, or whatever. As part of our Lean initiative, again, we've introduced an agile methodology for developing applications. I described in a previous meeting, it's more of an iterative approach to developing applications. We're actually delivering working software every 2 weeks in 2-week increments, providing more ongoing feedback as the application is being developed. Again, here, I think the business relationship managers will assist us in getting a better handle on what the business requirements are and tracking the progress of the project throughout the life cycle. Next slide, Sharon. Client communications in general, I felt was very poor. In discussions with folks around the agency, it was very clear that they really didn't know the IT staff, for one thing, except the folks who may be going up to their office to help them with PC or printer problems, that kind of thing. But to a large extent, they didn't know what we were doing, what our priorities were, what our projects were that we were working on. And I think the steering committee has really assisted in addressing that issue. Now we have regular meetings, at least once a month, with that group to discuss our activities and priorities. The business relationship managers, again, I expect will really help in that area. And the project portfolio management software I mentioned, once we have that fully implemented, we'll have dashboards available for our agency staff to go in and actually look at the status of their projects and determine if we're on track or what's happened to them. Lastly, we've revamped our ISS website. It's not up there yet. We have a prototype in place, which we're still fine-tuning, but we're hoping to provide a much more user-friendly website which will assist agency staff in identifying who to go to for problems. There'll be several how-tos for various services we provide and frequently asked questions, links to various policies and so on. Email and calendaring. I don't know where to begin on this one. Basically, this has been an ongoing problem before my time even. And just since the last meeting of this committee, there have been on 2 occasions full-day outages, entire day outages of our email and calendaring system. What that meant essentially was our staff had no access to email for an entire day on 2 occasions. They had no access to their calendars, no access to their appointments, and you can imagine the impact in this day and age that has on agency operations. It's been very frustrating. It's inexcusable. To address that, what we've been doing over the past year is looking at other ways of providing the email service. And it's basically looking at cloud offerings. We've looked at the Microsoft cloud offerings, Google Apps cloud offerings, and we've also got approval from DIR to actually have an exemption from the use of Team for Texas Data Center Services contract to go to a cloud. They themselves have gone that direction, as have some other agencies. Just this week, we finally got approval from LBB to actually transfer funds from our DCS operational, or I should say capital budget to our operations budget to pay for those services. So now we'll be formally kicking off a project to manage that transition over the next 4 to 6 months. It's going to be a big effort. We'll have to be managed very carefully, but we're optimistic we can provide ultimately much better service for our clients in a more reliable environment. Workload distribution is another area we had to address. Basically, we've revamped our entire processes for the intake of requests for support or for maintenance or for new projects, and the internal processes to manage those requests once they're within IT. This is also part of our Lean initiative. Our Lean consultant assisted in that effort. The Innotos product will also assist us there in managing our portfolio, managing our projects better. Haswell, another product that we've acquired called SysAid, will be used for managing the smaller type maintenance or break fix requests coming in, printer problems, PC problems, anything of that nature. So those 2 products, having a meeting Friday to discuss a strategy for rolling those out to agency staff over the next couple of months. The other thing we've done is set up a 6300 help desk number. I couldn't understand for the life of me why people, if they had a small problem to be fixed by IT, had to fill out a form on the internet and submit it, rather than just pick up the phone and call somebody. So we've instituted a 6300 number. If you have a problem, pick up the phone, call 6300, and we get somebody up there to fix it. I think that's been pretty well received. Next slide. Integrated print services. Well, one thing I found a little bizarre when I started here was the fact that we have so many personal printers in the organization. We have 275 personal printers and we have 275 staff members, which essentially means there's a 1-to-1 ratio of printers to people. We do have, so in addition to that, we have, I think, around 8 multi-purpose, multi-function printers in the agency, scattered scanners, scattered fax machines, no comprehensive strategy for how this all ties together or is managed. What we did last summer is we invited 2 vendors, Xerox and HP, to come in and independently study our print environment free of charge and make a series of recommendations for how we could be more effective and manage that print portfolio better. They identified potential for several significant savings, and I think that's not uncommon from what I've read and studied and researched. It's pretty common. You're looking at 10 to 30% potential savings is the industry experience for when we go in that direction. In general, the public sectors really lag behind the private sector in going to that kind of managed print services environment. By managed print services, I mean is basically having a contract so that it's outsourcing the management of the print environment. So a contractor, HP, Xerox, somebody like that, will actually provide the hardware, the maintenance of the hardware, the technical support for the hardware, provision of supplies, like when toner cartridges run out, they're automatically alerted to replace it, and also providing a consolidated billing for the entire agency so we know what we're actually spending on print services. So later on the agenda, there's an item where we're requesting the committee's approval to proceed with an RFP. IT skills were really outdated through no fault of the staff. The staff were working hard. It's just there was no training budget for IT staff. So the skills that they had were outdated, and you can imagine with the changes in technology almost daily how important that is. There were new products being brought into the agency to meet various program area needs, such as SharePoint, Laserfish for document management, and our staff really didn't know those technologies, didn't have any experience with those technologies. So fortunately or unfortunately, last year there was a staffing freeze in place, and I had several openings in IT which I was unable to fill. So what I was able to do is redirect some of those salary dollars to provide training for staff. And I think just about everybody on my staff had some form of training. So I think that's really improved their knowledge and skills. The other thing we did was use some of those dollars to bring in some consultants to assist us and transfer some knowledge in the area of SharePoint, Agile methodology, and also, of course, as you know, the Lean consultant we brought in to assist us. Another need we identified was for better technical writing and also training skills. And so we're currently staffing both a combination tech writer trainer and also a SharePoint person, somebody with SharePoint knowledge who can help us in that environment. We're currently using an old version of SharePoint. We really have to upgrade that. It's not an insignificant effort, especially since we don't know really what's out there in SharePoint. SharePoint sites have been sprouting up all over the place, so we really got to get a better handle on that environment. IT policies were terribly outdated. Over the past year, we've spent a lot of time rewriting those policies. They're now in kind of a last iteration within IT before we submit them formally to executive officers, legal department, and human resources for their approval. Lastly, next slide. Mobile technology. My staff probably gets sick of hearing me talk about this, but I really felt it was necessary for us to get ahead of the curve on mobile technology. As all of you know, that's the trend in the industry. That's the way the world is going. If you look at some of our stakeholders in the form of students today, and if you have kids of your own, you realize they're not using PCs that much anymore. They're not using email. They're using their mobile phones, their tablets, they're using social media to communicate, not email. And it's really necessary for us to get ahead of the curve and look for ways we can exploit that technology better to assist agency staff and our stakeholders. So what I've done recently is had my staff provide iPads for our executive officers. And what I wanted to do there was two things. One was kind of get a handle on what support problems or issues we may encounter if people start using these more extensively. and also provide something for our staff that go downtown during legislative sessions, something better than a laptop. A laptop's pretty clunky, it's heavy, the battery life is maybe a couple hours, so if you're downtown at legislature, if you don't have access to a power plug, you're going to have some problems. So by providing iPads, I think it's a much more useful device for people who do go downtown with a 10-hour battery life and lighter to carry around. So that was another objective I had. Of course, with mobile devices, the big concern is security. And we've acquired a product from Good Technology, a mobile device management product, which will allow us to manage those devices and isolate personal applications, personal data on those devices from the business apps, the business data, and also allow us to perform remote wipes of the devices if they're lost or stolen. We actually acquired that product last May, and as we speak today, Team for Texas are supposedly installing it. So it's taken them that long from last May to January to actually get that product installed. So that's highlights, I think, of what we've done for the past year. It's been an active year. My staff have undergone a lot of changes with restructuring and new leaders, new management, and a lot of new ways of doing business. Just looking ahead briefly at the coming year, some of the things that I have high on my priority list, first to build on the IT governance initiatives from last year. Now that we have the steering committee in place, I want to provide them with the proper tools and information they need to better make decisions on what the priorities should be, the Enotus product, dashboards, things like that. Continue to lean transition, evolution of our internal processes. We now have defined the new processes, but we don't have yet in place the tools to track those processes and develop metrics related to them. So that'll be the next step. The third area I'd really like to see us pay more attention is to provide better tools for board members and executive officers in the agency. And one thing we've been looking at is the automation of board materials. We've looked at several service offerings out there whereby we could post the board materials online, allow you to access them online from your laptop, from your iPad, or any other mobile device, and download them if necessary to those devices so you're not facing reams of paper.
Well, unless you can make that happen in about 2 clicks, I'm still going to print everything out. So keep idiot proofing in mind.
Yes, sir. Yeah, we're looking at user friendliness because some of them are certainly better than others in that respect. Other areas we want to look at are video conferencing. You may recall the last board meeting we had a gentleman from New York University. And to make that happen with the interactive video conferencing for that meeting, we actually had to go out and borrow the technology. We don't have it in-house. So what I'd like our staff to do, our technical staff are evaluating options whereby we could hopefully acquire some kind of more permanent capability, because my suspicion is that that kind of requirement's only going to increase. And it simply makes a lot of sense economically and every other way. Mobile technologies I talked about. Another area we've been working with Linda on is implementing some kind of a correspondence tracking and complaint tracking system. We've been looking at a system from TxDOT that they're offering to us free of charge, which is a nice price. So we're looking at that product as potentially meeting that need. I mentioned the migration to the new email encountering environment. That's going to be a significant undertaking, and it'll have to be managed very carefully, of course, with transitioning to that environment and making sure that nothing's lost in the process. And something I don't have on the list here, but certainly is going to represent a demand on my staff, is the fact that the state has now fired IBM as the provider of the data center services contract, and have now awarded that contract to Capgemini and a company called ACS. And the target date for transitioning from IBM to those 2 vendors is July 1st of this year. It's not a lot of time to handle that transition. We had a kickoff meeting last week with all the agencies that are involved in that transition, and we have another full-day meeting next week to continue the planning. But it's certainly going to place demands on my staff. But I like what I'm hearing so far from those vendors. I think it should improve things, provide much more responsiveness and quicker turnaround on requests. And we're optimistic at this point. That's really all I had to report on, and be happy to answer any questions any of you may have.
Yes,
Yes.
go ahead.
What was the cause of the outages? Is that why the company got fired?
Do you have a day?
Yeah.
The first one we still don't have a clear picture on. We actually had what's called a root cause analysis meeting with them. Dr. Alonso was there. That was, I guess, around 2 weeks ago with DIR and IBM. And they did a lot of skating around. They never did give a real good reason for what happened with that one. Basically, the system went down, and the problem was they were unable to restore it. And part of the problem they started claiming was the volume of our emails that are out there, which I found kind of a red herring, particularly since the second outage, which was 2 or 3 weeks ago, was simply a hardware problem that occurred just before 8 a.m. in the morning. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they finally got a part transferred from one part of Austin to the data center to replace it, and then they found out that wasn't even the problem. They had nobody on site that morning, so they had to get somebody to go on site. When this occurred at just before 8, they finally got somebody on site to start looking at the problem after 9. And it was just, I said to Dr. Alonso, it was like a comedy of errors, but nobody's laughing. It's just pure incompetence.
So if I may, Doctor, the process has been ongoing. As you know, well, you might not know, but they entered into this contract April of 2007. There have been a lot of problems with this. About a year ago, the state gave notice to IBM. They gave them what they call notice to cure. They worked with them. They eventually notified them that they would terminate their services. So it is not this incident, but a lot of incidents similar to the ones that we experienced in the last couple of weeks that have led up to them being terminated.
The email problems are only one example. I mean, every time they do patches, typically over a weekend, my staff have to be at home, kind of performing QA on their QA to make sure they haven't messed up anything. A couple of times I've come in Monday morning and there's 3, 4 different problems. I mean, it just blows my mind. I mean, IBM is a big company with a lot of experience, and from my experience in the industry, you do a good job. So I just don't understand what the problem is. I think partly it was a case of underbidding the original contract, and they simply don't have enough resources to provide the service we should be getting.
Will the new vendors explain the role of Team for Texas? Will the new vendors manage TFT?
The Team for Texas is just the name of that service, as I understand it.
Service that's provided by DIR to other agencies?
DIR, yes. DIR manages the contracts.
And how many agencies are now serviced by DIR?
There's 28 that are now transformed. The plan is to transform more. I'm not sure how many, but there's 28 so far.
Well, it seems like we'd want to get it right before transferring more agencies. I would hope so. I'm encouraged by what I've heard. For a couple of examples, they're planning to dedicate more staff, for one thing, and also have more continuity in staff. One of the problems we've encountered with, I mentioned the patches and backups, things like that, is that they don't have the same staff doing these things. They transfer them in and out from other contracts and so on, and there's no continuity, so they don't know our environments. They don't know our business needs. So the promise is this new vendor is going to have more continuity in their staff assigned to support us. Yeah, to blame a problem on our business needs, which, i.e., number of emails or whatever it is ludicrous.
It is. And then, like I said, that's kind of a red herring. There's a lot of larger agencies than us with a lot more email. Although one thing most of those agencies do is perform regular archiving of their email, and we haven't done that yet. With the new cloud offering, it will provide better archiving capabilities, so it's something we probably want to address.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
You'd mentioned over the past year that you've been able to retrain staff utilizing funds because of a hiring freeze. You've had reduced staffing. It sounds like there's a lot of demands on your department at this particular point in time. But are you managing? You're obviously getting it done.
I,
probably more efficient than before these things were installed. Is that Would that be a fair statement?
I think that's a fair statement. As I mentioned earlier, with the lack of IT governance, the staff was being stretched in too many different directions with no priorities. They were unable to concentrate or focus on one particular project because the next day the priority might change.
Well,
So
they
I
were firemen.
Sorry?
They were firemen. They were just putting out fires instead
Exactly.
of...
It was very much a firefighting environment. So I think with the new processes, with the steering committee in place, they're feeling a lot better. And with this new agile development environment, new way of developing systems, I think that's helping too because our clients are more closely involved in the development effort. So they're not, going away in a back room, developing something for 2 years and coming back with it. So there's more ongoing dialogue with our clients. So I think it's improved. I quite frankly don't think the problem is the number of staff. I think it's just the way we were utilizing them.
Okay. So based on that, you even though there's a reduction in staff, I mean, do you think there will ultimately be some overall cost savings in the IT area?
Cost savings in what form?
Well, I mean, you're obviously creating more productivity with less people.
Right.
I mean, that would equate to cost savings to me.
Yeah, certainly we think our staff are now more productive than they were a year ago. Because of these new methodologies, these new ways of doing business, the new tools they have in place, the fact they're better trained. So I think there's more structure, much more structure and better methodologies to assist them in performing their tasks. So I have no doubt they're far more productive than they were in the past.
Harold, that's a good segue to what I was primarily concerned at. And Sid, you touched on this, but I'm concerned that we're not there yet, and that's metrics.
Right.
The answer to those questions should have been measured. So if we can't say how we're being more productive, then I would really encourage laser focus on setting measurable goals and then creating a way to measure the results of your lean initiatives.
Very true.
To those goals. And in addition to that, as has been my experience, those goals should be ambitious, not just tweaking around the edges, but like on the order of 20% annual productivity improvements. Now, there are different ways to measure it. It may not all be dollars and cents. You might measure, for example, exactly lead time to complete a project or response to a user, or as you're referring to them now, customer need. What is it today? What is our goal? What is it, a year from now, or what is it right after the results of our next content event or whatever initiative?
If I may, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
One of the things that I was going to cover in my closing remarks is exactly that. I'm pleased to report that we have posted the position of, I believe it's called Director of Continuous Improvement for the agency, and that certainly will be one of the first tasks to not only carry forward the momentum that we've established and that we started, but obviously to look at other parts of the agency. But yes, to take what Sid has done and start setting metrics so that we can measure productivity and improvement and so forth.
That's so crucial for two obvious reasons. The first one, department heads like Sid obviously need and want to know, how far are we getting the ball down the field? Are we at the 20-yard line or the 40-yard line? But secondly, it's crucial because we need to lead by example and show other institutions what's achievable. And so hence my impatience. So
Understand.
I wanted to reinforce the same thing. If we can't measure it, we can keep on claiming all day long that it is wonderful, it's doing this, doing that. We need to be able to measure going forward. Maybe starting from now or from 6 months ago, what benefit did we get? Quantify the benefit. If we don't quantify the benefit, it can all sound good and it's wonderful. But people want to see the numbers and benefits.
Yeah. You'll recall the last meeting we talked a little bit about that with our experience with the Agile, because there was one particular initiative we undertook where we had a basis for comparison. The problem right now is compared to what? Because we don't have any metrics from the past. So what do we compare with? How do we know how much we've improved? Going forward, yes, we can start creating metrics for those things, but to compare to past performance is difficult, particularly in a development environment. I mean, IT to a large extent is not process or driven, it's a project driven, and every project's different. So, there are some difficulties in performing comparisons, between projects. I mean,
There's probably also some commonalities. So I would just, you point out a important issue or problem, and that is you do have to have a basis. But value stream mapping is one tool that helps you get at some of the basis. And the key is go back and find a way to measure it. And I think the posting of this position will provide someone who can help enable that, that whole process, learning how to use those tools. But you're right. You do need to create a good basis against which to measure and set ambitious goals, go attack them with improvement initiatives, and then come back and measure how you did.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to give you a big thumbs up for what you've already accomplished. Really, probably only one of us up here is a digital native, but the rest of us are really trying hard to adopt and understand how much more efficient it will make us. In that regard, I'd like you to really think about 3 things that you could do that would help me as a board member. One would be give me access to a secure server when I'm in this building. I need access not just to the public server, but to a secure server, so I can truly use or operate my platform here when I'm in the building. 2, cloud postings of board materials would be very helpful. In many regards, and I will talk to you offline about a couple of opportunities that I've used those on other boards. And I think the chairman, we can get you there with maybe even 1 click or 2 clicks. And
that's all I have patience for.
And really, we're going to have some education for us. We got to have somebody that sits down and says, okay, now you go here, now you do this. This is how you put a tab or a note. Here's how you put a note to yourself. Because we're used to tabbing up these board books, and if you don't know how to do that, and I had to learn, and I'm still learning, it's difficult. And then you say, well, heck, just give me the crutch, give me the book here, and then you're not using that. The last would be, I think we could have a huge cost savings in the cost of governance if we could actually have online meetings. And my challenge to you, and I guess legal counsel is going to say, how do we do that in an open meeting environment? And so, think about that. But if we could do some of our business between the meetings when we're at home and still not challenge the Open Meetings Act, we may not have as much in the way of travel costs and lodging costs and our governance costs in that regard.
That's in fact, David's idea is what might be useful would be to try to do just a quick and dirty survey of board members as to what tools or services would be helpful to the board members, so you could see if there's a consensus. If you may also have some issues that get 6 different answers, but one limiting factor we have to contend with, it doesn't mean it's not doable, but you either have to have a quorum, and this is by law. We try to get this changed, but progress is slow. You have to have a quorum that's either online or physically present, but you can't have a mixture of the two. And if your quorum is online, those who are, and Bill will correct me if I'm wrong, but those who are physically present can't vote. If your quorum is physical, those who are online can listen in, but they can't vote. They really are not even supposed to participate, technically.
Technically, that's correct. Yes, sir.
So the law has not really caught up to technology.
Right. But if I was here, I could be online also. Mm-hmm. And then we could call the quorum as an online quorum, and we'd all participate online, even though there's 4 of us sitting here in this room.
That sounds like it might take an AG's opinion or something, but not a bad thought.
He's a doctor, not a lawyer.
He's probably
he's a doctor who wants to be a lawyer.
With lawyers.
Certainly, some of the products we've been looking at have the ability to do that kind of thing and have voting through the web service. And also the video conferencing I mentioned earlier, I think would help that.
Just to that point on the video conferencing, that would be one of the things that I was kind of taken aback that wasn't just something that was already just SOP here. I would really encourage, even at my office down the street, we've got video conferencing capabilities, and it's a wonderful tool for a whole bunch of things that we've already experienced. Right. One other quick question. On the iPads for executives, how has that gone, and is that going to be expanded, i.e., I don't know, iPads for board members or something like that?
There might be a budget question in there. Yes is the short answer. I think the experience so far, and I don't know if the Commissioner, Dr. Alonso, would like to comment, but I think the experience has been positive so far. We've had very few support problems from a technical perspective that I'm aware of. We have now ordered iPads for the assistant commissioners, so we're taking it down a level. Before opening it up too much, we want to get that security product installed to make sure that we have secure environment. One thing we're looking at in our mobile policy is just how to handle what they call bring your own device technologies, where people may bring a personal device from home, an iPad, iPhone, and want to use it for business purposes as well. So how do we manage that? What policies do we need to have in place? What security do we need to have in place? So that's all part of our new policy that we're working on right now. But I think the experience so far has been positive.
I can speak to that. Fred, if you like 2 clicks, I like 1 click because I'm even more challenged. And the iPad has given me that ability. I used to take sometimes the laptop to the Capitol or whatever, but yeah, it's just, as Sid said, it's bulky, it's heavy. You have to connect to the internet or whatever. This is synchronized to our email. I'll open the email. I can manage it. I can, So, personally, I think it's a great thing. Yeah.
Maybe we can use iPad FaceTime as a video conferencing tool. Has somebody looked at that?
I use it.
I was in India talking to my grandkids on FaceTime, and I was asking my son in Houston to see if I can connect him with my grandkids in Monroe.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I will have to look into it. If we can do that, then that will become video conferencing on iPad.
Except you can't really see everybody, like on the committee.
Everyone can
which,
switch.
Yeah, you kind of
Well,
shift it around. But
on the budgeting part that you were talking about, Bobby, is I've served on another commission, and we found by going paperless, not paying for all the printing and the binding and all of these things, that you end up actually saving money in the long run.
I believe you.
This is very pricey once you start really talking about how much I don't know who you're paying to do all this, or if you do it in-house. But it is costly, and then I don't know if y'all have been to Fred's office before, but he has an entire room dedicated to just stacks of coordinating board materials. So anyway, just trying to save him from disappearing behind those stacks of.
It's really supposed to be a visual symbol to my staff at work so they understand why I'm gone so much.
But I think eventually it would be very quickly, it would be cost effective.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Sid. Thanks a lot. Any other questions, comments?
No, thank you, Sid. And I think I've already given the closing comments that I was going to give, and that is that I hope to move forward quickly and identify the right person that will take us to the next level, including setting some metrics to measure some of this. We've made progress, but we've got a long ways to go.
Yeah, I agree with David. Sid, there were, his presentation showed that there's a lot of good ideas and initiatives underway. It's just important to measure those results. So appreciate the report.
Thank you.
Next agenda item 4A is consideration of the resolution authorizing the issuance of the state of Texas college student loan bonds in an aggregate principal amount not to exceed $175 million. In one or more series, authorizing the commissioner to approve all final terms of the bonds, approving the forms of an official statement, paying agent, registrar agreement, and bond purchase agreement, and resolving the other matters related to the subject. And Dr. Alonso will be presenting this item. Thank
you, Mr. Chairman and members. This item is for approval of the resolution to issue the bonds for our student loan program. And before I call on Dan Weaver to present the item, I would like to introduce to you our new bond counsel and a new member of our financial advisor pool. Representing the firm of McCall, Parkhurst, and Horton is Ms. Carol Palumbo, managing partner of the firm's Austin office. She also has with her our co-bond counsel, who she will introduce, Mr. Bill Mahonis. Carol will present the proposed resolution, answer any questions, and so forth. We also have with us Mr. Bob Estrada from the firm of Estrada Hinojosa, who will be serving as our financial advisor for this issuance, and he's available to answer any questions you may have. Both Carol and Bob bring much expertise in their respective assignments. We look forward to working with him on this very important task, and so I turn it over to the panel that we have assembled for you.
I'm just going to say a couple of very brief remarks because I feel like y'all have seen enough of me this afternoon already. Sharon is passing out 3 documents. One is the estimated cost of issuance for a range of different values of bonds that we are going to contemplate today. The second document is the cost of issuance from our A series from last year, which was a $125 million of new money, and a B series, which was a refunding series, and then we also had a very small C series, which was also refunding. So we're going to give you kind of an estimated cost of issuance of what we're looking at going forward, as well as what we paid last year for cost of issuance. The agenda item calls out issuing up to $175 million this year. As a result of the session and the successful passage of Proposition 3, the coordinating board has the ability to issue more than our historical limit of loan or bonds, which used to be $125 million. This merely provides us some additional flexibility through the calendar year, depending on what demand is. If we're looking at the short look over the horizon says we're probably going to look at about a $75 million issue coming up. But if demand warrants a higher amount, then we will have the ability to go to market sometime between now and December 31st as a result of this resolution. So those are my brief introductory remarks. Normally, we would turn it over to our bond counsel, and she will walk us through the documents. And if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. So I'm going to pass it over to Carol now.
Good afternoon. I'm Carol Palumbo with McCall Parkhurst. I want to take just a minute. As Dr. Alonso mentioned, Bill Mayholmes is here with Mayholmes Bolden. He is our co-bond counsel in representation of the board in connection with the issuance of the bonds. One of my partners is also here that's working with me on behalf of the board is Richard Donahue. And then one of Bill's partners is also here, Steve Bolden. So I just want to make sure. Happy to go through the bond resolution, I think just to give you kind of a high-level explanation, and then we can go through your questions as you would like. As Dan has mentioned, this resolution does, together with the other documents in your packet, authorize and effectuate the issuance, sale, and delivery of bonds in one or more series up to a principal amount not to exceed $175 million. Also, the resolution delegates to the commissioner to actually finalize the pricing and the final terms of the bonds, the method of sale of the bonds, and all the other details in connection with actual pricing. So as you can imagine, the best date to go to the market to sell bonds is not always around a board meeting date, and so this provision of state law allows the board flexibility to find the best market for pricing. As Dan also mentioned, the delegation that is authorized to the commissioner under this resolution is through December 31 of this year. Once that lapses, we would come back to the board for any further authorization. And I think as was brought up earlier in the meeting, the bonds do carry the state of Texas full faith and credit general obligation pledge. They are treated as self-supporting because the actual payment does come from the loan repayments, but as authorized by the voters of the state of Texas, it does carry the state's full faith and credit. And I'm happy to answer questions you have about the resolution or the other documents that actually effectuate the issuance and sale of the bonds, the delegation of the pricing, or any other items.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
I'm not very smart, so you just got to bear with me and help me out here on a couple of things. Sure. I'd mentioned something to Dan a little earlier, and he said that maybe Mr. Estrada or somebody might be more able to answer the question. But there's a provision that indicates that we won't issue bonds for less than 95% of par. Why would that provision be in there? Why would we not be issuing bonds at par? Is that just market fluctuations? That's Section 203B in the bond resolution.
Legal requirement, isn't it?
Well, we do have to, under state law, put parameters under which we can delegate the pricing to the commissioner. And so we do have to set, if you will, kind of a floor on what the price can be. And as Mr. Scotta can attest, the market often fluctuates as to what price that they are looking for on that particular day, and sometimes it may be better from an interest rate perspective, and I'm going to kick it to him, that those buyers are looking to buy at a discount. So, but we do have to have a parameter in there, and the 95% provides the maximum flexibility to obtain the best rates.
And within that parameter that's required by law or by your resolution, then we do have some flexibility there in adjusting the par amount and the interest, whether investors will pay a premium for the bonds or buy them at a discount. In this market environment, they're paying premiums, but we have that limitation of how much premium we can put on there, where they may ask for a higher coupon on the bonds than what the actual interest rate should be, and so they'll pay more than par in that case. That's the we don't anticipate selling any bonds in this issuance at a discount, but perhaps a premium.
Okay. What do you, based on current market, what would you anticipate the rate and price to be if you went to market today?
With the usual disclaimers that we can't predict the future, we actually were involved we were in the marketplace today at our firm. Our headquarters in Dallas was involved in a sale of some refunding bonds for a school district in Texas. Of course, the school districts, when they enter the market, have the permanent school fund guarantee that makes them AAA rated. But this school district sold bonds today. I think we locked in the rate about 3 hours ago. It was a 20-year serial maturities, about an average life of 9 years overall. They came in at a true interest cost of 2.11% interest.
Okay.
And the 10-year Treasury right now is hovering at about 2% on a taxable percentage rate. So that's we certainly are very optimistic about getting you a very aggressive rate for this bond issue.
Okay. Well, Dan, I do appreciate you providing the cost of issuance on these in the future. I mean, I'd just like to see that in the board materials, even though the cost of bond counsel and financial advisors is in the bond issue. I think it behooves us as a board to kind of know what these bond jockeys and lawyers are charging us. And I didn't see that until, I'd ask you about it. And I just think we ought to know that information beforehand. From the review, looks like even though you're terribly expensive, it's still pretty much in line with any flexibility there that you guys can help us with? I mean,
Well, the tax code, United States tax code limits the kind of bonds that we're selling, limits you to a total of 2% of the proceeds is the most you can spend on cost of issuance. I think the total you're seeing there is well below the 2%.
Okay. So just because the federal government set it at 2% and you're lower than that, it's okay. Okay. Also, Dan mentioned that we're probably not going to be doing any interest rate swaps on this transaction, but there is a provision in the documents for that. Can somebody kind of explain to us in layman's terms? I mean, you're going to sell these bonds and they're going to be deposited with some, I guess, with the state?
State Treasury.
Okay, so we're not really doing any interest rate swaps then? The money's going from bond issuance to the comptroller.
That is correct. And right now, as a financial advisor, we're recommending that there wouldn't be any reason to entertain an interest rate swap in the kind of environment we're in right now. Fixed rates are at such historical lows that we recommend doing a fixed rate issuance and locking in your money for the length of the bond issue.
Okay. So then, but the bonds are accruing interest once we issue them, if we do $75 million, then we're going to have a negative interest spread until we get all the money lent, and hypothetically, from a cash flow standpoint, until those loans start getting repaid?
Yeah, that's correct. We typically have a cash balance depending on demand. We currently have a cash balance that will get us started into the next academic year, our lending season, which typically starts in August. Really, that's going to determine what the size of the issue is. But yes, we're going to have negative carry, and the negative carry is going to last anywhere from likely going to be 12 to 18 months, because the cash that we get from this particular issue will finish the next academic year and start the next academic year before the next issue over the summer.
Okay.
So there's a window that we'll use these proceeds. It's within there's a 3-year limitation on you have to use the proceeds, and we're well within that 3-year limitation. But we are sensitive to the fact that we are going to have negative carry, which ultimately sizes the amount of money that we would go to market for.
Okay, so, and that would be the cash flow analysis that just kind of projects that out into the future?
It would be the demand that we would estimate for the students from an allocation standpoint institution. So if we expect to do $95 million of loans next year, we need to have $95 million of cash available in order to make those loans. That really determines the size of the issue.
Okay. Is there part of the bond issue that's held, I mean, at the time of issue in the event that it doesn't work, or is it just the assumption of the whole portfolio of the coordinating board? And I mean, when we issue the bonds, it's just the loans that are made with this issue of money. It's not cross-collateralized or anything. It's, okay.
And I might clarify that the bond proceeds will be invested by the Comptroller's office,
right,
but not at the rate that we're paying the interest rate on the bond in this environment.
Dan, I think you answered this, but just for the board's benefit, that I think the Cal loans are like a 3% origination fee to the student.
3%. If I as a borrower, I'm a good cosigner. And I also have a cosigner that's creditworthy. So if I have two creditworthy, a borrower and a cosigner is 3%. It's 5% if I just have a cosigner. So the origination fee is a little bit higher if I just have one creditworthy cosigner.
Okay.
So
but I mean, in reality, these cosigners, I mean, I would assume in a normal circumstance would be a parent or parents.
Most of the time, but not all.
Is it one parent or two normally, or
one person cosigns?
Okay.
Sometimes it's an aunt or an uncle. Sometimes it's another family member. I don't think there's a requirement that it be a family member. I don't think it can be a spouse, though. A spouse can't cosign a loan for their spouse.
Okay. So, and you mentioned to me that this origination fee is basically if they get a loan for $1,000, then they get $970 with the 3% or 95.
Correct. 3% comes off at the front, and then they ultimately pay us back for the full $1,000 plus any accrued interest that would have occurred from the date that the loans were dispersed.
Okay. So if we're at 5.25%, which the rate the commissioner set, and the bond rate is 2.5%, whatever, and then we've got a 3 to 5% origination fee in there. Are the excess proceeds between the cost of the bonds and the rate on the interest rate, does that just go into an account?
Well, there's some limitations that I totally bored you with at our last AOC with regard to arbitrage calculations.
Well, that was my question.
So we have limitations on how much profit we can make, for lack of a better word. But those excess repayments essentially go into the interest and sinking account first to pay debt service. If we have excess in the interest and sinking account at the end of the fiscal year, above and beyond what our debt service obligations are for the next fiscal year, those monies then are transferred back into the auxiliary fund to make loans with. So
Okay.
it's a recycling of excess repayments. So
Okay, so there's not any forgiveness of the loans back to the original borrowers or anything at that point?
No, sir.
What is the arbitrage limitation?
for a purpose, it's 2%.
Okay.
But it's for a purpose 2%, inclusive of all of, and you might want to talk to this and so.
Is there any way we can apply some of this money to the defaulted loans, older defaulted loans, more than 10 years old, more than 20 years old, so that we can clear the old accounts and start with a new slate?
I don't think the bondholders would like that.
Well, I guess ultimately the bondholders own the program, for lack of a better word, but we're all at parity, so there really isn't the notion of paying off somebody else's defaulted loan doesn't, that those two things don't line up together. I'm not sure I can answer your question the way that you've characterized the question.
Except no.
I was looking at 5.25% minus 2.5% is 2.75%. That money that comes in, can that be applied towards the defaulted loans?
Maybe bond counsel can add to this, but I would say that in all the bonds that you've issued that are still outstanding, there were probably covenants contained in those resolutions in the previous bond issues as to how the dollars can be used and the repayment money used, and that's pretty restrictive. And you've made those promises to those outstanding bondholders. You would need the consent of the majority of the bondholders of the bonds that are still outstanding to change how you use those repayments, I think.
Yeah, that is true. It's all trapped into the funds with the authorized purposes, and if you think about it, the program dates back to the 60s, and all the bonds have been issued on parity since then. We do have the state GO pledge behind it. However, it was always intended that this be a self-supporting program, and that's why all the dollars kind of trapped in here for the benefit of the bondholders and the program to the extent it's relent.
All right. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Going back on Harold's question, Dan, how do we decide who's going to be our financial advisor and who's going to be the legal counsel on this bond? Did you all have RFPs? Were there multiple counsels applied for it? Would you hear a comment on that?
Yes, we did. We issued RFPs. I can't remember when it was, but and we went through the competitive process.
So in those RFPs, I would assume that they basically told us what their fees will be and whatever their charges will be.
That's correct.
Okay. And that was considered before we made a decision. Did the board approve that? Or
No,
just at the staff level?
under Board Rule 1.16, the chair and the vice chair approved that. We had considerable discussion with the board chair and vice chair, answer their questions, and it was approved under that rule.
Great, thanks.
And the timing was not that long ago, so the upshot of it was that the RFP resulted in a change from bond counsel. V&E had been bond counsel for several years, and although I think at some point in the past your firm had served in that role, but because of the response to the RFP, we made a change.
I was just surprised that Harold wanted to negotiate right now and not earlier.
He wants to renegotiate.
You can always ask. You just never get any money out of them.
I just want to make a comment. We should point out that Bob is a longtime friend and leader in Texas higher education, former member of the University of Texas Board of Regents.
Wonderful.
We're not going to hold that against him.
Thank you.
Are you saying there's a potential conflict?
No, I'm saying just the opposite.
Move to approve.
You have a second? Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries.
Thank you.
Agenda item.
Thank you
is-
very much, Gil. Thank you.
is 4B. Is consideration of adopting the Commissioner's recommendation to the committee to issue a RFP for selection of vendor to provide managed print services for the agency. That's what Sid had talked about earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I talked about this earlier just to provide a little additional information. I mentioned we have 275 personal print devices in the agency. The average age of those devices is over 6 years old. The recommended life cycle for a printer is 3 to 5 years. Because of the age of those printers and also the wide variety with over 40 different models, over 50 different cartridge types, it creates an increasing support demand not only on the users of those devices but on my staff, and we estimate about half an FTE a year in supporting that print environment. The other factor I don't think I mentioned when I was up here last was the fact that the legislature zeroed out our capital budget for the current biennium. So basically the money we had relied on in the past to provide new PCs, printers, and so on has gone away. So we have no money no capital funds to buy replacement printers. I mentioned the two vendors that were in here looking at our environment made recommendations, but what we'd like to do now with your approval is get some firm prices from vendors, not just those two but others, and then evaluate the wisdom of going in that direction. I know there's been some questions about, well, what about the productivity issues if people don't have personal printers and so on, and one of the vendors in fact did factor in a value for the loss, if you like, of productivity in their calculations, but there's so many offsetting savings and productivity improvements. For example, when you look at personal productivity, somebody using a personal printer, what's not considered is the time that person takes supporting that printer, replacing the paper, replacing the cartridges, the fact that those print devices are typically much slower than a multifunction device. So if they're printing a job, it's going to take them that much longer to get the job. So yeah, they may have to walk a little further. The other factor is, undoubtedly there are people who, based on their job responsibilities or the type of printing they do, have a requirement for personal printers, and that'll be a decision of their department head. But I think for the most part, when I look at the statistics we compiled, 15% of those printers printed less than 5 pages a day. 34% of them printed less than 10 pages a day. And with these multifunction devices, they provide much greater capability, not only printing, but scanning and copying, color printing, stapling, collating, 3-hole punch, and so on. So I think there's a lot of advantages to that type of environment. And the fact it's managed externally. So, it frees up my staff, it frees up staff throughout the agency for, filling out purchase orders to buy, cartridges and dealing with the purchase orders, the inventory, the billing. Now we'll get one consolidated bill for the entire agency. So hopefully I can gain your approval to proceed with the RFP.
How much are we planning to save with this new RFP? How much money can we save?
Well, the estimates, based on the numbers we got from Xerox and HP, and mind you, those were marketing efforts, if you like, but both of them came in the range of $70,000 to $90,000 a year in savings, potential savings, in direct costs.
Can we eliminate this printing completely, like Janelle was saying? Can we go electronic so that there is no printing necessary?
Well,
a lot of people are doing it. Medical
Dan
doctors
Weaver
are
and I
doing
have been talking about that, and I think in this day and age, there's no reason why a lot of the printing we do now cannot be eliminated. And I look at having a personal printer. I've worked in 6 different organizations in senior management positions, and this is the first place I've had a personal printer in my office. And what I find happens is inevitably I'll print stuff just because it's convenient, and I really don't need to be printing this, but if I want to follow up with one of my staff members on something, I'll print their email and put it in a folder, but really I don't have to do that. So I think a side benefit of having the getting away from the personal printers is a lot of unnecessary printing will disappear.
Would it make sense, Sid, to just rip the Band-Aid off and just say the policy is no personal printers, and make that part of the
Well,
RFP?
I'd probably have a lot of people throwing things at me. But
that's okay. They'll get over it within 30 days, probably.
I know McGregor in his area has already gone in this direction, but what we've done with the installed base of printers as they die or as they run out of supplies, at that point they're being, phased out. So it wasn't like a Band-Aid approach, but that's certainly one option.
I think maybe worth exploring the.
If doctors can do it, I think Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board can do it, David.
Fred, I think what you're suggesting is really part of what we're seeking in the RFP, for them to come and tell us, what is the ratio, what is the correct ratio, and how can we network, say, 5 offices in one area that are in one area into one printer, and eliminate some of those personal printers. So I think that is part of what we're seeking.
You took a good first step. Nearly half of them print less than 10 pages a day, if I heard the numbers right. So at a minimum, you ought to make half of them disappear.
I would think so.
The cost savings, does that include, can we get some money for these printers when we get rid of them?
The fact they're 6.5 years old, I doubt it.
Sounds like you'd be lucky to get somebody just to take them off your hands.
That's right. I think, and the more modern ones we'd probably keep in our supply, and those ones would be used for people who could justify having one. But I think for the most part, they're write-offs.
Well, it sounds like what we ought to do is allow executives to take them home so that next time the email goes down, they can print stuff out at their home.
From their personal email, right?
No, for their work email.
Any other comments? Sorry. Harold, you had?
Not on this item, but I certainly will. I move to approve.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Sid.
Next item agenda is 5A, is an update on the State Auditor Office report on distance education. This item is a reporting item only, does not require any committee action. Ruby Garcia will be making a presentation, and I think we should have a VP of distance education or director of VP education in Texas Higher Education. I think this can save a lot of money. Like we are trying to have a program for $10,000 degree program. I think distance education can help us towards that.
Good afternoon, Chairman, board members. I invite Dr. Van Davis up front with me in case there are any questions regarding distance education. This particular item was an audit that was performed by the State Auditor's Office. Can you hear me? And the state auditors concluded that the agency is administering the program per the Texas Administrative Code and Texas Education Code. They did note a couple of improvements. One was for us to place a link on our main webpage pertaining to distance education, and the second one was for us to incorporate a specific review specific to distance education data that's submitted through the CBM reports. And we have, management has taken corrective action to address both of those issues. At this time, we would like to entertain any questions that you may have about the report.
Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, if I can make a question. When I was reviewing this, I noticed a couple of things that kind of just jumped off the page. Why do we not have it a standard to have everyone report their expenditures and revenues from the distance learning as a standard for everyone involved, all of the campuses involved? I noticed that some said that they did not report. And then also, why do we not have a standardized definition of what revenues and expenditures are for all campuses?
And this is something that really Susan Brown would need to speak to, but we are, you may or may not be aware, we do have Rider 57 from the General Appropriations Act is actually requiring institutions to make a report to us about what the costs would be of putting their 4 most popular degree plans online. And I've been working with Susan's staff to develop a template that we would be sending out to the institutions, but I'm going to kick this over to her for definitions.
Okay, the reason, we have a standard definition for all their accounting. It's called the SCUBO. It's a national standard for all universities and colleges. What it doesn't do currently, and that's probably a matter of the accounting standards lagging reality, is that it doesn't separate that out. We will be using those standards for the survey that Van was talking about and have it moved apart and have them allocating those costs separately using the same NACUBO standards.
One of the things that you may or may not have noticed, the auditors surveyed all of the general academic institutions, and you may or may not have noticed that many of them chose to not share some of that information, citing confidentiality agreements with companies.
We have talked to our attorney, and they can share the numbers. They don't necessarily have to share which company.
So when you say the NACUBO standards don't separate, you're saying that the standards don't separate the online revenue and costs from all other general program
Correct.
revenue and costs.
But, Mr. Chairman, won't that become more of the standard if, in fact, this does develop to where
Yes.
those numbers will become readily available?
We hope by starting that process through this survey and making sure that it follows those NACUBO standards, that we will be able to do that, and institutions will hopefully make sure that they get it that way right now, because a lot of them do not capture. If you have one faculty member who is teaching both face-to-face and online, they'll just lump them into a program. They don't necessarily differentiate how much of their time is spent with online versus face-to-face. And so that's going to require some going back through their records to get that information.
And that's the majority of the faculty members that are teaching online courses are going to fall into that category. Most institutions are not going to have faculty whose sole purpose is to teach online. Most of them are going to have faculty who are primarily teaching face-to-face, but may be picking up one or two courses and teaching them online throughout the semester or the academic year. And so I think, and it's very similar with program costs. You know, most institutions are offering face-to-face programs and an online program in the same area. They're using the same administrative support structure. They're using the same faculty. They're using a lot of the same elements. And so finding ways to differentiate that may be difficult.
Can we change the format of our questionnaire so that we can help them report this information to us, like department by department or college by college, rather than the whole university?
That is what we're working on right now. We're developing what we think is the right format. Then we will be taking that to the
the Learning Technology Advisory Committee is going to look at the template that we're developing for Rider 57 next Friday when they meet. That committee is also working on looking at sort of an overall assessment of distance education across the state. The auditor's report only dealt with general academic teaching institutions, the universities. The majority of semester credit hours being offered either online or on hybrid blended format are from our community and technical colleges, not our universities. So the data that's in here even represents a smaller section than of the statewide level than what you might think.
Well, obviously one of the frustrations of not having either not having full response, not including community colleges, and having standards that don't separate out the cost is we always hear, well, you know, it's not necessarily cheaper to offer a course online, but there's no disaggregated data that proves that right or wrong.
There was a study, well, the Learning Technology Advisory Committee is taking a look at this issue. There was a study, though, that was done at, I believe it was Duke. If not, it was UNC Chapel Hill about 3 years ago, where they disaggregated the information for their online programs. And
what they found was that the costs were actually very similar, because the majority of the costs always end up coming back to faculty and instructor costs, the human personnel costs, not the technology costs. I think that what that indicates to us as a profession and as a state is that if you want to see the cost efficiencies develop, then you have to find a way to handle instructor costs differently. That could be disaggregating the roles of instructors, like what we've seen some institutions do. It could mean finding ways to scale up very large, like we've seen Lamar do with many of their Master of Education programs. Or it could mean moving from an instructor-based program to a competency-based program. And we have 2 institutions that we met with yesterday that were developing a grant proposal to the Next Generation Learning Challenge grant that would do just that. It would create a degree, a baccalaureate degree that would be primarily competency-based. And that becomes a way of moving much further towards reducing costs of degree and doing a better job of leveraging technology to do that.
2 interesting facts that really underscore what you're saying, Van, is that those who did respond, 64% of the cost was faculty and instruction.
Yes.
But it's also interesting that over 2/3 of the institutions have been offering online courses for more than 10 years.
Yes.
What it tells me is they've just been doing the same old for more than 10 years, and that they're just taking their existing courses and slapping them online, as opposed to changing course delivery to take advantage of the technology.
To some extent, yes, that is happening. I think that we do have a few institutions that have been much more methodical about how they leverage the technologies. We saw this when we looked at the course redesign grants. We've seen a few of our institutions that have really begun to move to hybrid and blended learning, so that students are meeting maybe once a week face-to-face, and they're using that time to do problem-based exercises, and then pushing what the other 2/3 of instruction would be online. And that, in theory, can bring up some efficiencies in terms of facility usage and some other things. So we have some institutions that are being more methodical about how they do it, but many folks, I think, are still tied into what really is an agrarian academic calendar, and that quit working a long time ago for most of our students. It really is not necessary to continue now when we talk about distance education, specifically online education. Now, having said that, the Department of Education did, in their regulations that they released last year, try to institutionalize the Carnegie seat time definition for semester credit hour. So we have some difficulties there in terms of what regulation agencies external to us are expecting for defining semester credit hour, and what some of our institutions and more innovative folks are looking at doing around competency-based education and other things.
Can you talk to me a little bit more about competency-based? I think I understand the concept.
Sure. So one of the schools that does this quite a bit is Western Governors University. You may have seen actually a press release day before yesterday that Excelsior College, which is, I believe, a proprietary school in upstate New York that's accredited by the Middle States Commission on Higher Ed, announced that they were offering a $10,000 bachelor's degree, and theirs is entirely a competency-based program. The idea is that the faculty craft a curriculum where they start with what the learning objectives are going to be for that program level. And then they have the broad learning objectives, and then they look at what are the learning objectives that lead to each of those broad programmatic student learning outcomes, and develop assessments to gauge whether or not a student has mastered those. And then if a student hasn't mastered those, they develop materials, usually materials that can be accessed online, that a student can use to begin to master that material on their own. Usually what's also on top of that is a set of online academic support services, things like Smart Thinking, My Math Lab, programs that are usually very adaptive to the individual learner, so that in the case of math, they can be working on a concept and they get to move on to the next when they show mastery, but it still throws questions at them about the old stuff, and if they ever get those wrong, then they go back and they get a refresher. So some just-in-time educational resources.
So you would actually probably take a pretest, which would identify your deficiencies within that, and then you may be put into a learning environment, which much more smaller groups of people who have missed that one concept.
Correct.
Learn that and then retest until you get to what you're saying is that you understand the concepts that are necessary to say, I get this course, and then move on. So this would be self-paced. So it really wouldn't be the traditional credit hour, other than you'd get credit hours for passing the test.
No, it's self-paced instruction, and it is, and that's sort of the beauty about it, and it's one of the ways in which it does a really good job of leveraging the technology to help teach. A student can spend as much time as they need to on a material until they can master it, or they can accelerate through as quickly as they can. There's no reason why, and I'm going to use, say, college algebra as an example, because math's probably the easiest to apply this to. There's no reason why a student shouldn't be able to take a pretest in college algebra, see what they've mastered, see what units they haven't. They don't need to take the entire course. We're already seeing this happen with some of our developmental education courses, where a student doesn't need to take the entire course. They just need the material on the pieces that they haven't mastered. And actually putting them through the entire course is detrimental to their learning.
So what is the criticism from the education traditional proponents?
Well, in the case of the Department of Ed with the regulations this last year, it had to do with auditing purposes, how they could audit financial aid specifically. Financial aid, state and federal, is still calculated on semester credit hours. And obviously we're talking about, when we talk about competency learning, we're talking about something that doesn't fit that box very well. In fact, we had a long discussion about this yesterday.
But if it doesn't cost $50,000 and you can get it for $10,000, maybe you don't need financial aid.
Or you don't need as much of it, yeah, exactly. Other proponents argue that learning, there's some students that are going to be self-starters and who can take the initiative to learn on their own and have the maturity to do that. And then there are some students who this is not going to play to their learning strengths. And they may need to have more one-to-one attention. They may learn better as auditory learners. They may learn better when they're in a physical group of people. Competency-based education so far has been used primarily with returning adult students. And they're the ones that have really demanded it because of time factors. But there's also a maturity factor that's at work, too, I believe.
And I want to follow up with something that Fred was talking about here, too. Have we benchmarked where there's efficiencies within this? There seems there's a tremendous amount of duplication, yet it's being done online. Why do we have to have this offered by 20 different universities? Why not benchmark the two that do it the best and say, that's where you're going to get your degree if this is what the degree that you want in, a master's in education, concentrating on such and such?
I think we're beginning to have those discussions. One of the report that we are tasked with creating from Rider 57 requires us then, after the institutions provide us with the information, to look at what the most cost-efficient programs are, and then the most effective programs. The challenge, though, with that effective piece is that we're not going to be looking at programs that are physically online yet. So we won't be able to project that effectiveness. But we are starting to look at how we begin to, is it a good idea to add another MBA program that's being offered online, and how can we make some of those decisions? And I know David has a lot to say about that.
I really appreciate you making that remark, because for years it seemed to me that the efficiencies with online programs would come from essentially narrowing it down to the institutions that do it really well. It may cost a little bit more in the initial development because they can really take advantage of the technology, but because of the increased volume, they reduce cost. And we haven't really done that. We've really essentially had a situation in which any institution, I mean, there is some oversight, but can develop the program. And I think that's one reason you hear that it's not necessarily cheaper, because if one school decides to develop an online program, even if they do it essentially the same way it's always been developed, a faculty member develops stuff and puts it online, as you suggested, the technology costs more. But if you developed it in a way that some institutions have, perhaps one in your part of the state, where you take full advantage of the technology, you can reduce those costs. And so I think that's a discussion that should be had at some point. Should it be that 5 institutions perhaps are offering extraordinary online MBA programs, and we sort of essentially almost franchise them to do that, and maybe it comes up every 5-6 years. But I do think that's something that has to be at least considered, and is maybe the next sort of iteration of distance ed.
The only follow-up on that, and then I'll turn it over, are some of these hybrids where there actually is a residency requirement? You actually have to go to the campus and meet on a regular basis, and it may be a travel issue.
And that is the case. And when we look at actually our doctoral programs, we have 10 doctoral programs that we would characterize as pretty much 100% online. Most of the rest of our distance ed doctoral programs, though, are hybrid. They have some online component and a face-to-face component, or they are electronic to groups, which means that they've got a video conference feed coming in, and so you've got a group of students in one place and a faculty member and maybe another group of students in another place. So there is oftentimes these issues of programs having some face-to-face components built in. Some of the literature in the field is starting to suggest, and unfortunately there's not a lot of data on post-secondary distance education right now, but some of the, at least secondary literature, is starting to suggest that a blending of online and face-to-face may actually lead to better learning outcomes for students. But most of the data there is on secondary education and not post-secondary education.
I heard you talk about just-in-time education.
Yes, sir.
Can you explain a little bit more for me to understand what just-in-time? I know there is just-in-time manufacturing, but are you talking about adult education or what?
It's actually, it's probably something very similar. The idea is that a student doesn't have to learn everything that they might need to know eventually, but they can begin to learn in pieces. We saw it a lot with engineering programs a few years ago, and the idea was that, you know, in a traditional engineering program, a student would take a number of math courses as prereqs before they ever got to an engineering course. And a lot of times engineering programs started seeing poor retention because students weren't able to get into the engineering courses yet, and they just never quite got there. And so what some folks started doing was building the mathematics prereqs into an introductory sequence of engineering courses so that a student got those math concepts just at the time that they needed to deal with the engineering coursework. In distance ed, it's very similar, and with the whole idea of competency-based education. You know, a student doesn't need to sit through or work through all of the materials. They only have to work through the materials that they need to in order to master what they haven't mastered yet.
This was, you know, part of the reasons for what we're talking about was why Texas launched Western Governors Union Texas several months ago. It's a competency-based online learning environment where, and they do target primarily adult learners.
They do. But, who have considerable semester credit hours earned already.
Yeah. In fact, I think part of their business development effort, if you will, is to actually identify those students, go out there and find the ones who are X number of credit hours away from a degree, and then market, you know.
And their chancellor, the WGU Texas Chancellor Mark Milliron, is actually going to be speaking and meeting with the Learning Technology Advisory Committee next week to start talking to them about what WGU Texas is doing. And he's a figure that many of them know already and had worked with in other capacities.
You know, and I would be interested in whether there are strategies they've considered, or we could encourage them to consider to expand or broaden into more traditional community college course delivery.
I think that, with community colleges, one of the other things that we have right now is the VCT, the Virtual College of Texas, which really probably speaks closer to what ideas of efficiency are. The VCT sort of functions as a collaboration, so that if a student at, say, Odessa College needs a class and they're not offering it, that student can get that course from Austin Community College online without having to register as an Austin Community College student. They remain an Odessa College student. They pay all of their tuition and fees to Odessa College. The course gets transcripted onto their transcript just like they had taken it from Odessa College, so that they don't have to do any sort of transfer of credit. We don't have anything like that at the university level, although the Texas A&M University system has been experimenting with something like that. And certainly one of the things that I've seen happening more in the last year is a lot of folks are talking now at the university levels more about competency-based education, and also ways to collaborate more across schools and across systems, so that you can also hopefully get some economy of scale there too.
Yes, sir. Harold?
I don't pay that much attention to it, but I see quite a bit of advertising on television or whatever, these private universities that have degree programs and that sort of thing. And, my thought has been, from what I've read, is they're very expensive.
They are.
I don't know what their graduation rates or anything else are, but does anyone know what product they're putting out and how that compares to what a public university system's product is?
Well, the Congress has been taking a close look at those proprietary schools because they are so expensive, and because their default rates on financial aid are very high, and their students receive a large amount of federal financial aid. They vary from school to school. The ones that are accredited by a regional accrediting agency probably are more like what our public universities are, in that our publics are also accredited by a regional accrediting agency. They are much more expensive, though, and it's going to vary from school to school and from degree program within that school. I think what we are seeing happen, though, EDUCAUSE did a report probably about 6 years ago that they went out and did some surveying of students, and what they discovered was that if a student could take the same distance education program, same courses, same degree, same format, and if they could do that from a proprietary or do that from a public, they tended to do it from the public that was in their backyard, because even if they never set foot on campus, they had a closer identification to that public institution than they did that massive proprietary institution. What those big proprietary institutions have done a really good job of is being more flexible, doing some competency-based education, doing accelerated courses that aren't tied to a semester, doing rolling enrollments, so that it becomes more flexible and fits into especially working adult schedules much easier. I think many of our publics are beginning to do those things as well, because they realize that this is a student population that they need to address and that they have a responsibility to address. And we have some publics that are doing it very well too. Many of those were in the first wave of our Grad Texas launch.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had just two final questions. In the audit, it specifically mentions Lamar University and a contract amount of $7.5 million, which is more than almost three-quarters of the entire state, all the institutions. And I think, David, that's who you were referring to, and I think we heard testimony at our last committee meeting about the explosion in their Master's in Education degree programs. Is it because they had such huge volume, and that's an appropriate number?
Yes.
And are they benchmarking? Are they doing it well?
Yes. The thing about the Lamar Master of Ed programs, they lead to certifications. And so what they've been able to do is compare the pass rate on the state certification exam for their online programs with the pass rate of the state certification exam for their face-to-face programs. There has been very little, if any, difference between those pass rates. I've not seen what their pass rates were for the last year, but I know the year before last, when I last looked at them, they were completely in line with the pass rates for the face-to-face programs at other institutions across the state. So they also recently went through their reaccreditation visit from SACS, and SACS reviewed those programs and that partnership very, very closely and, signed off on them.
So this number here, this $7.5 million, is appropriate and it's value-based?
That's not data that they reported to us. That's data that they reported to the auditors. I
don't see anything in here the auditors had a problem with that.
Well, one of the problems with that particular set of data in the audit report, and they do say this in the report, is that many institutions did not report the amount of similar contracts. When I look at that section of the audit report, I can think of at least 4 other institutions that have partnerships with academic partnerships that don't have the cost data for that contract in here. So I don't have the information to do that comparison. I would guess with the volume of students that they are doing, it's probably appropriate, but I'm not privy to their contract. So it's hard for me to give you a solid answer on that.
Probably something we need to look at if we're really going to benchmark these institutions and make a decision if we want to continue the expansion unchecked.
Yes, sir.
Okay, last question. The American Board of Radiologists recently released a report indicating that there had been a widespread plagiarism, cheating scandal going on for decades. Are you familiar with this?
I'm not familiar with that particular report, but I'm familiar with the general concerns.
Well, radiology residents for years apparently have been contracted to go and memorize 5 or 10 of the questions on the board examination. Those have been subsequently compiled through generations of radiologists, and those are available, widespread available to the residents, really rendering the question as to whether or not there's any validity in the test. And my question is, with this online learning, are we concerned at all that somebody else is taking my PhD for me? How do we address those type of concerns? Because I think the security of the actual degree granting is really of concern to me.
Those are concerns that are taken very, very seriously by the institutions. Many of our institutions use software that does several things. Sometimes they use key tracking software so that when a student goes in to take an exam, it actually monitors the rate at which they are typing. It monitors the sites that they are visiting on their computer while they're taking the exam. Other institutions require students to have webcams, and students take the exam in a semi-proctored environment where there is somebody on the other end of that webcam at the institution, and they're watching the student take the exam at their computer so they know if it's the right student or not. There's a number of security protocols that are in place now that make it, I would argue, make it as secure as a student who's in a 500-student face-to-face introductory lecture class. If I'm the professor standing at the front of the room and I've got 500 students in my class, I don't know each one of those students by face. Somebody could be slipping in and taking that class for somebody else, and I might not necessarily know it. So there's insecurities in face-to-face education as well. I think that distance education has had to directly address those and has been doing a very good job of doing that.
Hopefully they do better than the defensive driving.
You notice I didn't mention that one.
Don't let the DOD know about those techniques.
If y'all are interested in the semester credit hour data for the last fiscal year and how that shows increases over the last 10 years, I have a handout here that you're welcome to take a look at. I'll hand it over to you, but it shows what the semester credit hours are, the percentages of distance ed for in terms of total semester credit hours, and what the graphs look like as increases for the state for community colleges and universities since 2000.
We may, yeah. I mean, a lot of that might be helpful, and some ideas and requests may come out of the retreat we're going to have later this week. But for instance, I'd like to see outputs from the VCT to kind of get a feel for how effective it's been, because that was talked about in our cost efficiency. But I do realize that this is actually an audit report and turned into a policy discussion. So
I had a question, but I think this will go into policy discussion. On this format that we are preparing, the template that we are preparing, can we have impact of distance education on research? Will research be conducted by these people the same way that face-to-face education does or traditional education does?
I think that might be beyond the scope of the rider. The rider is actually very, very specific about what information we can ask for and what information they can give us. And I think that may be beyond the scope of it. I know that when we look at our distance education doctoral programs, the faculty teaching in those programs are engaged in research just as much as faculty that are teaching in the face-to-face programs. But I think that may be beyond the scope of the rider that we have to respond to for the Rider 57 report.
All right, sir. Thank you, Dr. Davis. Any other questions? Any other comments? Then we can move on to the next agenda item. 5D.
Thanks. It was a great information.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Common.
Thank you, Van. Our next item relates to an audit that we performed, the Texas Armed Services Scholarship Program, and we found that the program is administered in accordance to the Education Code and the Texas Administration Code. We provided a copy of that report to you. Do you have any questions about that?
Mr. Chairman, only question is I just was curious if we had updated numbers on the number of nominations. The report was for fiscal year 12 was as of November 21st.
Yes, we do. As of yesterday, we had an additional 15 nominations.
So it's now at 85 as of yesterday.
Yes.
We have one more. Actually, one more. We have 86.
Okay.
86.
As of today.
As of today.
Thank you.
That's pretty current.
Yes.
Real time.
Are there any other questions? Okay, thank you.
We can move on to the next agenda item.
Okay.
5C.
Yes.
And the last agenda item is an update on the internal audit work plan. And again, this item is a reporting item and does not require any committee action.
Thank you. Our next item was a follow-up audit of Concordia, and I am happy to say that based on our follow-up work, they have taken actions to address a finding that we had during the course of the audit. And we provided a copy of that follow-up report. Are there any questions associated with it? Thank you. Our last item has to do with the status update from internal audit, and a copy of that was provided as well. May I entertain any questions?
Any questions? Well, if there are no questions, this concludes the Committee on Agency Operations meeting, and I guess I can take a motion for adjourning the meeting.
So moved.
Second? Second. All in favor? Ready to go for dinner?
So housekeeping, what time does the dinner with iCut